everyone. So today, this particular discussion is going to be about the Renaissance period, the Renaissance literature and culture. So the Renaissance period is called either the Renaissance period or the early modern period. So there's different reasons for calling them different things. Renaissance, as you've probably heard, means rebirth or renewal. And you may ask, a rebirth or renewal of what? And the answer is of classical learning, so learning from the Greek and Roman periods. So what people who call this term Renaissance are trying to connect it to the cultural shift that happened in Italy in the 14th century, which eventually came after the next 150 to 200 years to England. It doesn't hit England until the 16th century, essentially, which is quite a bit later than when we see the Renaissance in Italy. So people that call this period the Renaissance are trying to connect it with that rebirth of classical learning that starts in Italy and spreads throughout Europe. Other folks call it early modern, and these folks are emphasizing the shift away from medieval ways of viewing things and medieval culture and towards modern culture. So they're arguing that this period paves the way for modern culture, and by calling it early modern, they're dissociating it from the medieval period. Renaissance has more of an archaic flavor, I guess, and early modern kind of connects it to the contemporary world a little bit. So it just depends on kind of who you're asking and talking to, but essentially these two terms for England are interchangeable. To this slide, you may remember from earlier in the semester about how medieval folks wrote manuscripts. And I just have this slide up to remind you that it meant killing an animal, skinning it, all that stuff. It was quite the elaborate process. So something comes along that actually, in many ways, is what shifts the medieval world into the early modern world. All right, so the thing that helps the medieval world shift away from medieval culture and into the Renaissance or the early modern world is this little baby right here, which is the printing press. So the Chinese had printing technology, but the Europeans hadn't had enough interaction with them in order to obtain or widespreadly obtain this printing technology. So it had to be developed separately in Europe. And that happened by Johannes Gutenberg, who's a German inventor, and he develops it. And it starts to change the way that Europe is able to do literacy. And then William Caxton brings it over to England in 1476. So this is an important time. And it's really the thing that allows England to enter the Renaissance as opposed to Italy, which had hit it earlier. But England really, once the printing press hits England, things change completely. And printing ends up democratizing publishing to a large degree, and it actually allows for the kind of pamphlet debates that you're going to be reading in this unit, especially the tracks on women and gender that you're going to be reading. So it allows for those kinds of pamphlets debates, and it essentially allows for early newspapers or tabloids, whether they were small chapbooks or large broadsides, which are the size of newspapers. And these big pamphlet debates raged, right? So the pamphlet debates, like the ones you're reading this week, represent the rise of print culture because anyone could get in on the game. You can see both male and female writers engaged in the question of what constitutes appropriate behavior for women and men. And this is part of the backlash caused by the rising access to wealth and opportunity that women had in the 14th and 15th centuries. But the difference is women have access. They're able to play the game here and able to respond to the things the men are accusing them of. We see the resistance that they are showing to gender inequity, even though it's framed in religious rather than secular arguments. So what I'm saying is in the debates that you were reading in Unit 3, you're going to see the so-called War of the Sexes. And this also represents violent backlash to women stepping outside the social roles prescribed for them, both in Swetnam's piece and in the Hic Mulier, Hic Vir pieces about what women could or couldn't wear. And some of the things that are said in these texts aren't so different than what we still see today. This whole dichotomy of like, are you a virgin or a whore if you're a woman? But then other things are very, very different. Like Sournham and Spate don't seem to really want to make the argument that women are totally equal, but that they should be treated respectfully. So you can see it's sort of a step. So the examples from the print culture, the tracks on women and gender, are evidence of the egalitarian effect the printing press had on English literature. Before this, you didn't see as many people from the middle and especially from the lower classes writing as much. You didn't see women writing as much, and you certainly didn't see the kind of quick back and forth topical discussions that these pamphlet debates represent. Kind of equivalent to what our contemporary social media debates might be like. So let's start in this printing house by the stuff on this side that I just circled for you. These folks over here on this side are compositors that are consulting this little copy text that's nailed to the wall right here. And they're taking pieces of movable type from their case and placing them into this form here. And that's going to end up going to these guys that I'm circling right now. And these guys are assembling the type assembling the movable type line by line using a composing stick. And the guy that's standing up holding the copy text is double checking and reading to the guy who's actually putting the moving type together. And then they come over here to the printing press where they put ink on the movable type, and then they press it down onto a piece of paper. And that's what the printing press actually does. It presses the ink onto the paper, and that's why you can just keep pressing them over and over and over again until you have as many copies of that page as you might need. Then the copies have to dry. So here's some of them hanging up to dry. And this fella is helping to set the ink with his little leather satchels there. Then this fella here down in the bottom is putting all of the pages together in little packets. You can see they're getting tied up back here. And this person is taking one of those bundles off away. So this is how the medieval printing house worked. You can kind of see it's almost run along a factory line where different people do different parts and it moves from one thing to the next thing. And this is how they were able to suddenly do hundreds of copies of things within a day or a week instead of it taking months and years. The printing press also affected the language, but that's something that I'll talk about in a separate lesson about language, but it underwent a series of changes. In particular, the printing presses helped to standardize spelling in a way that was not true during the medieval period. But again, I'll chat about that later when we actually get to that section of the lesson, a later lesson rather. So one of the aspects of the Italian Renaissance was this renewed interest in classical learning that, like I mentioned, and in particular in literature, in education, and the arts. There was an ideological shift, an ism, right, that characterized this intellectual movement, and that was humanism. So humanism is something that begins in 14th century Italy, again, where the Renaissance begins for Europe. And humanism has a number of different tenets, I guess, or aspects. One of it is that there's a move towards a secularization of knowledge. So it doesn't mean that folks didn't talk about God anymore, they weren't still members of the Catholic Church or anything like that, but instead of things having to be so connected to religion all the time, there's a move away from that and a move towards knowledge for knowledge's sake, instead of maybe only strictly being interested in how that affects one's religion. And the other thing that develops is what we would now call a liberal arts education. So the notion of a curriculum for humanism develops. They called it the Studia Humanitatis, like the liberal arts education. And it was comprised of grammar, rhetoric, moral philosophy, poetry, and history, all as studied by classical authors. So you can see now how the humanism and that liberal arts education directly ends up becoming what's now the humanities, which is what we are a part of here in literature. So grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, poetry, history, these are all the contemporary humanities, and they date from this period. And as I've mentioned before, humanism offers a revival of Greco-Roman traditions. One of the other tenets of humanism is a belief in the value of humans, right? So instead of this medieval view where serfs maybe didn't have as much worth as aristocrats, humanists argue that all humans are innately valuable. And therefore we have the ability to construct knowledge ourselves, right? So we want to look at sources ourselves. to the sources, right? Ad fontes. We saw this a little bit already earlier with the religious reform of the desire to look at the Bible oneself or take a look at that oneself. So humanism formalizes that idea that we should be able to do things ourselves, because as humans, we are worthwhile. We are fundamentally worthwhile, and therefore we should all be valued and treated with respect, regardless of what our social class is. And that notion still undergirds the humanities today, right? It gets expressed in terms like social justice, things like that. But the idea is that we believe in the worth of all human beings, regardless of their ethnic background, their gender identity, their sexual identity, whatever they identify as, their religious background, that all humans deserve fundamental respect. That's still an important idea undergirding all of the humanities today. All right, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is some developments in science, or the area of science, and so empiricism is one of those. Medieval scientists relied heavily on the works of classical writers like Isidore of Seville, Aristotle, Plato, for their knowledge of the human body, of the world. They saw these older writers as kind of like a great compendium of knowledge that got passed down, and you had to retain that knowledge. So if your practical experience challenged the knowledge that you gained, it's because you were somehow wrong, right? The folks providing the knowledge were the ones that knew. However, Renaissance scientists had a different approach, right? Their idea was, yes, listen to the authorities, but go ahead and check yourself. So they started to want to back up this book knowledge or reading knowledge with empirical knowledge in particular, with knowledge that you construct yourself through use of the senses. So that's what empiricism means. Empiricism means developing or analyzing the world based on the data provided by one's own observations and sensory experiences. And that's like, what do you see? What do you smell? What do you taste? What do you feel? What do you hear, right? Those are the senses. And that is the shift away from medieval views of science, where they actually start to take let's look at the human body and see what it actually looks like so that we can figure it out, or let's test these things and do it in a systematic way. In fact, they developed a new method for thinking about how to come to conclusions about the world. And that new method we still call the scientific method. So Francis Bacon is usually the one who's credited with developing and advancing the scientific method at this time, in a couple of essays, which you can see the titles of here: The Advancement of Learning, Novum Organum. And Bacon argues that proof is the best experience, right? Instead of just guessing, let's take a look and see. And when we have proof, that will teach us. And half of science is putting forth the right questions, right? We have to set up the questions right. And this is what the scientific method does today. It sets up a question. That's what the hypothesis is, right? And then you test, you look for that proof. Does our hypothesis bear out, or do we need to adjust it? So Bacon says, an error hath proceeded from too great a reverence and a kind of adoration of the mind and understanding of man, by means whereof men have withdrawn themselves too much from the contemplation of nature and the observations of experience, and have tumbled up and down in their own reasons and conceits. So he's like, there's too much of a reverence for book learning and not enough experience of nature, right? Our own observations of the world. Upon these intellectualists, which are notwithstanding commonly taken from the most sublime and divine philosophers, men end up seeking truth in their own little worlds and not in the great and common world. So if we're stuck in just reading what some certain people have to say, and we don't use our own senses and our own powers of observation, then we're likely to get taken in or to misunderstand. All right, so both humanism and empiricism represent a move towards critical thinking, right? Towards challenging and revising authorities rather than just listening to authorities sort of without sort of just uncritical acceptance of it. So science in the Renaissance was changing, but they didn't reject everything that the medieval world had developed. And one example of an idea that carried on from the classical period through the Renaissance was that of the bodily humors, or what they call humoral medical theory. So the idea that there are these different liquids traveling through our body, and that when they are out of balance, that is what causes us to have various medical and personality disorders. And they correspond to the 4 elements that I mentioned in a lesson in last unit that were believed to make up the earth: fire, earth, water, and air. So the 4 humors sort of correspond to those in terms of how they function with us internally. They were also kind of a psychology in a sense, like depending on what your humors were, that helped affect your personality. So if you had a lot of blood, right, too much blood, that's called sanguine, which meant you were happy and optimistic and energetic and flighty. But if you were sort of, if you had too much phlegm, then you're calm and rational and maybe lazy or too chill, right? Black bile means you're emo or melancholic or easily depressed, right? So, and so the idea was that those could get out of balance, and that's why you had folks do things like bloodletting. Like if you've ever heard of barbers and medieval and Renaissance barbers. So the idea was that if you let out the excess humor, the whatever one, if you had too much black bile, then I need to cut you in a place where I'm going to release black bile so that you will be in balance again. So this is where the idea of bloodletting came from, and why they would like cut you and release blood from different parts of your body. And the different places on the body and the different ways in which they cut you were designed to release the different humors in particular, and thus restore you to balance and therefore fix you. And in some ways that's totally off base, right? But in other ways it still does undergird kind of the way that we think about the body today, because we still think that it's chemicals, and that when those chemicals are out of balance, that can contribute to both medical and mental wellness issues. I mean, we have a different sense of how those chemicals function and how to get them back into balance, but the idea that there's things inside us that become out of balance and that affects our mental and physical well-being still undergirds a lot of the way that we think about Western medicine. One other thing that happened in the Renaissance period that had not really taken place at this extent in the medieval period is the advent of colonial expansion. So in the medieval period, there was trade, but there were fewer examples of European countries taking over through military or economic exploitation other countries. And you're welcome to, obviously, as I'm talking, you can watch the little graphic here, which kind of shows you how colonial expansion happened from 1497 through the contemporary time, and you can see the date on the side as it runs through. But 1497, so the very end of the 15th century, after the advent of the printing press, so as the Renaissance as the world is starting to shift into the Renaissance from the medieval period, that's when we get John Cabot's first voyage to Nova Scotia, which is England's first exploratory foray across the globe. And then we see a lot of other countries getting into the mix over the next 100 years. The next big accomplishment of English colonialists was 1577, when Sir Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe. That means he traveled all the way around it in a boat. Shortly thereafter, 1585, Sir Walter Raleigh attempts an early colony in Virginia called Roanoke, which in 1587 was totally lost, and there's a lot of speculation as to what happened to those folks. In 1600, the East India Company was chartered, and this is one of the companies that ended up being part of the slave trade. Elizabeth founded the English version of the East India Company in 1600, and that continued in 1603 when James took the throne, and by 1607, then Jamestown, Virginia, was the first permanent English settlement in America. And shortly thereafter that, so that's 1607, by 1619, the first group of enslaved African people arrive in the U.S. on a Dutch ship. 1620, that's when the Plymouth ships come. So that's when the ones that you probably know about, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, all that stuff, that's 1620. So these are all things that you'll probably be learning about if you end up our class 309A, which is the American Literature one. It's the early American literature, like the equivalent of this class, but for American rather than British literature. But you can see then the shift away from the more localized politics of the medieval world into this more globalized politics as well. And as colonialism expands, there's a number of other consequences that happen that we'll be talking about in later PowerPoints, such as the development of ideology suggesting that whiteness is good and blackness is bad, so racist ideology, as well as some other things like that come up. So In particular, the sort of fetishizing or exoticizing of the colonies or the places that were eventually going to be colonized is a theme that arises a lot in literature. You see a lot of talking about exotic cultures and writing about them in ways that other them. All right, that's a lot of information for you, I know, and that's enough for one day. You'll get some more info in the next lesson. Thank you very much.